Welcome to Rituals for Healing Grief, Connection, Transition, and Transformation. This particular presentation is part of a larger series of presentations sponsored by the Bereavement Department of Penn Medicine Hospice. The purpose of these videos and presentations is to provide support and education to grieving people. This particular presentation, again, will focus on rituals. And if we start with the definition, we can see that rituals are defined actions that incorporate symbolic elements like photographs, music, or memories, and other things, and that help to bring meaning to a loss. Research has told us that rituals can contribute to an ongoing connection to the deceased person. They can also contribute to a transition from a life with the deceased person to a life without the deceased person. And they can also contribute to the transformation of a bereaved person as they move from that life with a person physically present to them to a life where that person is no longer physically present. Why use rituals around grief, you might ask? One of the reasons is that we do live in what's oftentimes called a grief avoidant and death avoidant culture. That is, we are not a culture that tolerates loss, especially death, rather well. Very often, people who are grieving feel that those around them may want to rush them through their grieving process, or may urge them and encourage them to move on or move forward, or to quote-unquote get back to normal. This can oftentimes happen very early on in the grief process. Research tells us that oftentimes between 3 months and 24 months after a death can be the hardest part or the most challenging part of a grief experience for many people. However, it is actually during just this framework of time that others may be encouraging grievers to quote-unquote get over it, or that they should be further along their grief journey than they actually are. For this reason, rituals during this time can actually be very helpful for individuals as they move towards a healing process. Also, not everyone is open or not everyone needs grief counseling. Some people find it very helpful, others do not necessarily find it helpful, or they do not feel that there is a need for them to engage in counseling. However, most grieving people do agree that it is at some level helpful to actually talk about the person who died, their memories of the person who died, and their thoughts and their feelings around the person who died, what they learned from them, and how they are managing their current lifestyle after the person has died. So what this is really self-expression. And so rituals actually can help in the facilitation of that self-expression. Many people, after a loved one has died, have to figure out, who am I now? What is my identity? Who am I in a world without this particular person? Rituals can help tolerate those questions. They may not provide the exact answers, but they can actually help to allow grieving people to sit with these questions. I'd like to talk predominantly about some of the characteristics of rituals. The first is, as in the definition, they are actions. Oftentimes rituals, because they are actions and they involve us engaging in actions or a series of actions, they actually can help to provide a sense of comfort because they lessen the sense of powerlessness that we may feel after a death has occurred. For many people, there is a feeling of things being completely out of control when a close one has died. Oftentimes, even prior to the death, many things feel out of their control. Rituals can actually help people to feel like they have some degree of agency or control over what is happening in their life, especially if they are part of designing or implementing the ritual. Another characteristic of rituals is that they are ancient. Archaeologists and anthropologists and sociologists tell us that rituals, especially rituals around death and dying, go back tens of thousands of years. And they may incorporate a number of different elements like music, incense, particular places where rituals are held, particular topics, or things that can be used during rituals, such as candles and other memorabilia, dancing, and even food. All of these date back thousands and thousands of years. Rituals are really rooted across cultures, and so many cultures around the world, although the rituals may vary from place to place and culture to culture, the one commonality that is cross-cultural is that people mark things with rituals, especially transitions and especially death and dying. As just mentioned, rituals oftentimes mark transitions. Rituals other than death actually do occur. Things like bar mitzvahs or bat mitzvahs or confirmations or baptisms, marriages, graduations, and then of course funerals. These do mark transitions. Bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs mark the transition from childhood into adolescence. Graduations mark that transformation or transition between school and work life, or one school or one level of education and another. Marriages mark the transition between a single life to a married life. And funerals mark the transition between a life lived here on earth and a life without that person here on earth. Various religious beliefs may also hold that it marks the transition between a life here on earth to a life somewhere else in some other dimension. Funerals also mark the transition for grieving communities as to a community with the person into life inside a community without that particular person present. Rituals also serve as containers for safety. Just like these photographs show that containers for toys actually kind of put things into some type of an order or keep things a little bit neater or more orderly, rituals can also create what we would call a container, a place for holding what happens during that particular ritual. For a ritual to be successful, especially a grief ritual to be successful, there needs to be some type of a container or something that can actually hold what happens during that ritual. Again, rituals that are well done can serve to keep things that are oftentimes messy, somewhat organized, and somewhat able to be tolerated, sat with, and expressed in ways that can be helpful. Rituals also are boundaried with a dedicated space and a dedicated time. There's usually a location for a ritual, a place where it happens, and there usually is a certain time period established for when the ritual begins and when the ritual ends. This can help especially during grief, when things feel overwhelming and it feels like grief could go on interminably or without an end, that when there is a specific time designated for a ritual, there helps to create a sense of safety and a sense that there is a beginning and an end to the ritual. Again, these things help to create a container where it feels safe to explore the many different feelings and thoughts that can surface as we're going through a grief experience. Rituals also hold a structure. There is a structure to them. Usually there is something that props them up. There is something that happens first, something that happens second, and something that happens third, and so on. This structure also helps rituals to feel safe and also helps those engaging in the rituals to feel safe and that they are able to explore what they need to explore in ways that they need to do that. In these pictures, there is a photograph of the facade or the front of a late medieval Gothic cathedral. You can see how high the cathedral goes. You can see the structure of the cathedral. Prior to this particular time in the medieval period, churches actually did not look this tall. They were not this tall. They were much shorter, usually about a third of the size of this cathedral, or maybe smaller. If you look at the picture on the right, you can see what are being outlined as what's called flying buttresses. Buttresses just mean supports. These supports actually hold the building up. You don't see them from the front, but in the back, this particular part of the structure allows the cathedral to go soaring up into the sky. Whereas previous churches were not able to do that, this new innovation in architecture in the late medieval period allowed the churches to become larger and taller with very, very tall spires and bell towers. In much the same way, there may be parts of a ritual that are structured so that the ritual can actually become larger and bigger and be held up by its structure. The ritual can actually contain more and more for people if there's better structure available to it. Part of the structure to a ritual is that it is prescriptive. That is, it is normally very, very well defined. There is a beginning, there is a middle, and there is an end. There's a beginning to the journey, a middle part of the journey, and an ending of this particular journey. And the ritual itself actually helps to define how the ritual goes. This can be very helpful for grieving people, again, who may feel very overwhelmed by their feelings and who may not actually know how to go from one part to the other. Rituals then actually provide something very, very safe and secure, almost like a ladder, showing us how to go from one step to the next so that we don't really have to think about it too much. Having something prescriptive and something defined, something that tells us the way and leads us through a series of directions from the beginning to the end can be very helpful for grieving people who then can simply follow the ritual and become a part of it without having to think too much about what is actually happening. Rituals actually also help us to slow things down. We live in a very fast-paced society. When someone dies, our entire world can be turned upside down. As mentioned earlier, sometimes people wish to rush us through this process. Rituals actually help to slow things down. Some research on rituals talk about a movement that rituals create from chronos time to what's called kairos time. These are ancient Greek terms. Chronos time is time that can be measured in minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, and years. It can be quantified. Kairos time is time that really can't be quantified, that can't necessarily be measured. A lot of times we're in Kairos time when we might be driving down the road or taking a long drive, and we almost miss a particular corner or a turn, or we miss a particular exit off of a freeway because we just kind of zoned out a little bit. Kairos time can also be experienced when we are watching a movie or a film that really engages us. Kairos time, if you're an artist or a musician, oftentimes happens when we are practicing or playing something or playing an instrument, or drawing or painting or creating sculpture. Sometimes hours can go by and we have no idea where that time went as we are in the middle of creativity or watching something or enjoying something that we like very much. That kairos time, that immeasurable time where time seems to almost stop, is what rituals allow us to enter into. The structure and security of rituals help us to move from that minute by minute, moment by moment time to that more undefined time and hard to define time known as kairos time. Rituals slow things down. Another characteristic of rituals is that they actually help us to contain what might seem to be contradictory or polarized emotions, such as sadness and joy, anxiety and peace, confusion or clarity, aloneness and togetherness. We may feel all of these feelings after someone we care about has died, and this is why grief can be very confusing. A ritual creates a time and a space and a container where seemingly contradictory emotions can actually exist together. And instead of being opposites, oftentimes rituals can help us to see these seemingly contradictory emotions as being part of a greater whole. Rituals help us to hold seemingly contradictory emotions at the same time. Another characteristic of rituals is that they often involve what we call sensory stimuli, or things that stimulate or activate our senses. Music, as mentioned earlier, can stimulate our auditory system, or our hearing, our listening. Incense can stimulate our sense of smell or our olfactory sense. Incense also can create a mystical atmosphere because we can see the incense as it burns off the wafts of smoke that go through the air. So it's both a visual stimulus and also an olfactory or smelling stimulus. Sometimes touch is involved in rituals. That's the sense of touch or our sense of being of the tactile. Sometimes things like candles can be used. That stimulates our sense of our visual sense or a sense of sight. Candles also can create an atmosphere of physical warmth, but also if lights are turned down and candles are lit, it can stimulate a sense of emotional warmth as well. Flowers sometimes are used, especially during grief rituals. They provide us, again, with stimulus to our sense of smell, but also our sense of sight. And sometimes food is used during rituals, or in many traditions, there is a repast after the funeral. A repast is a meal that is shared among all of the grievers who are present at the funeral. But food also can be used during rituals or can be a ritual in and of itself. That stimulates our sense of taste. Oftentimes, rituals will combine one or more of these elements that stimulate our senses. Rituals also help us to stay connected to the deceased. Within the context of a ritual, we do acknowledge and we do accept that the person is no longer physically present. But in some ways, rituals actually can help us to understand that our relationship to that person is being changed from one that is external, where we see the person and interface with the person externally, to one that is internal, where we relate to them internally in our minds, in our thoughts, in our hearts. Rituals generally help to facilitate grieving by allowing us to feel less isolated or less alienated. Oftentimes, rituals involve one or more people or a group of people. When we engage in rituals where other people are present, it reduces our loneliness. Rituals can also help us to begin to make meaning of the loss, or at least begin to allow us to sit with the questions that the loss brings up. Why did this happen? Why did this have to happen in the way that it did? Why did this happen now? Why is this happening to me? What will happen to my family as a result of this loss? Where is this person now? Why did they leave me in this way? Why do I even feel the way I feel? Why do my feelings change so quickly around this? Why do I have many different feelings at this time? Why does my body even react towards this loss? All of these questions involve meaning making. Rituals, again, may not answer all of these questions, but rituals give us the time and the space and the container in which to at least ask these questions and sit with these questions as our sense of time slows down so that we can sit with them. Rituals also help us to understand that grief is an ongoing process, that while death is an event, grief as a healing process is ongoing. And lastly, we know that rituals can help us to honor the deceased person. They can help us to renegotiate our relationship with that person, again, from a relationship where they were physically present to us to a relationship where they are no longer physically present. And they can help us to transform ourselves as we begin to transition from a life without this person, or a life with this person, to a life without this particular person. These tasks are not easy to engage in. Rituals can actually help us to ease some of the pain that comes along with the loss of a loved one to death. I want to thank you, and I hope this presentation was helpful to you in understanding what rituals are and some of the characteristics of rituals and why they may be helpful in helping to process the loss of a loved one or someone important in your life. These are some of the references that were used during this particular ritual, or during this particular presentation. If you're interested, you may look up some of this information here. Thank you again for your attention.